Pete Brock. I mean, like, first of all, Pete Brock, who did this stuff with Datsun, BRE and all that kind of stuff and did all these other, I'm kind of like, I mean, he came to interview me at an IMSA race. I don't know when that was, late 90s or something like that. And I'm kind of like, you're interviewing me? Can I just talk to you?
Race cars are much closer to aircraft than they are to production cars in many, many regards. And it's probably why I have a greater affinity for aircraft than automobiles. I said, if you have a better idea and it's done right, and the car is fast, you win. If it's wrong, you lose. Okay, welcome to It's Not the Car. I'm Sam Smith. I'm a journalist. I have been known to go club racing. I once flew to Italy. So it's nothing to do with club racing. I once flew to Italy to drive a prototype Lamborghini at the factory, and I was up all night with jet lag, and I missed dinner, and nothing was open that late. So I ate this entire 5-pound bag of Haribo Gummy Bears I had bought at the airport, and that choice never came back to haunt me, I swear.
I'm Ross Bentley, and I have driven from the Red Bull Ring to Vienna with 12 Haribo Gummy Bears on the dash with my co-driver, Colin Brown, sitting next to me, and we made it there without knocking him over.
Why?
Because I like to drive.
First off, I believe that because of course, Colin is that smooth. Of course, Colin Brown is that smooth, and the Gummy Bears never got knocked over. But what, did you just get bored and put them on the dash? What happened?
So first of all, hey, give me some credit here. I was driving. Colin was coaching me.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. No, that makes sense. That adds up.
And we put one of them there because there was actually a lightning storm going off. And you know what? Seeing lightning through a gummy bear is pretty darn cool. So then if one's cool, then you need more. And then it became a game of how many can we get up there to stand on the dash for as long as this trip is going to be.
Okay.
It was a challenge.
This goes on record. This goes on record. This is a nerdy, dorky-ass show, and this is probably the nerdiest, dorkiest moment we've ever had. Ross, I feel like we've bonded. Thank you. Jeff, how are you?
One of the highlights of my life.
Hi, I'm Jeff Brown, and I have no idea what to say after that.
You're the father of the guy that started this whole thing.
Right, and a friend of the guy driving the thing, which I think clearly comments on my character. I don't know.
Well, or lack thereof, you know. I mean, we're all a little broken. Some of us are just broken. I was going to say something
like, I drive a motorhome around, but I'm never in Italy and never with gummy bears on the dash. So it's pretty lame in comparison. So hi, I'm Jeff Brown. I race engineer cars. And
You're right. That's so much lamer than what we said. That's so much lamer than what we said.
I didn't even get the chance to say that I coach drivers, and that's why I was driving from the Red Bull Ring to Vienna with Colin Brown. Yeah.
Also, other trivia you need to know, Colin is Jeff's son, and he's a pro, and he drives for a living. And this is probably, I don't know, if he ever listens to this, he'll be like, okay, cool, so I'm never going on their show. All right, so moving on. This is what we call our centerpiece episode. It's the monthly stop where we pull apart a great story from racing history. Today, we're going to talk about the time that America surprised the world and, in a way, itself by winning its first FIA GT championship. This came at a time when few people thought that was possible, which means we are, of course, going to tell the story of the 1964 Shelby Cobra Daytona Coupe, which means, in turn, that we're going to talk about some California hot rodders and this genius designer and some people that the designer worked with and how the designer got laughed at and how the whole thing was just hung on people believing in their guts and their brains, often in spite of the facts. Now, this is a subject near and dear to my heart, not least because, well, I'm a giant dork, but also because I once wrote a great big, heavily researched oral history of all of this for Road and Track. I talked to the folks who were involved in that whole thing, who were still alive. And then to cap all of this, we sourced a 6-figure tool room copy of a Daytona Coupe, just accurate down to the last micron. And I did some laps in that car at Summit Point, and the designer was there, and he watched and made fun of me. And the cool part is he was making fun of me. He's a really nice guy. He's still around. He's fantastic. But he was making fun of me because I wanted to climb into this thing, this pinpoint copy of a race car built to run Le Mans in the 1960s, more than 180 miles an hour, blah, blah, blah. And the owner had told me, go just drive it quick, slide it, see what it feels like. And I wanted to do all of that in a helmet and full Nomex and, a race suit, as you do. And the designer, this guy named Pete, well, Pete said, "What are you, some kind of baby?" Because Ken Miles, who Pete knew, Shelby's legendary house test and development racing driver, this guy who was later played by Christian Bale in a movie, the guy who had been his friend, well, Pete said Miles tested these things in a t-shirt. So I took a great big breath and I ditched the Nomex and went out and slid the thing around in fourth gear in a t-shirt and just kind of marveled at all the places life takes you and how I couldn't believe I got there. Ross, you're making a face.
Sam, you said you slid the car around. I got to know, like, was it on modern tires or was it on sort of the bias ply tires kind of the period?
It was
60s?
on whatever the modern repop of treaded bias ply racing. I mean, you can call it a tire. I mean, it also might have been built out of granite or ice or wood. And it was, we can get to this in a bit, but yeah, the car was about as close as you can get to one of the, $20 or $25 million Daytona Coupes without actually being one.
So it was slidable.
It was slidable in the way that it didn't, the cars, it didn't slow down. You could put some yaw into it and it still felt alive and didn't just kind of bog in a corner, right?
And to be clear, in a t-shirt.
In a t-shirt.
Okay.
And the whole time,
anything else?
I'm picturing all of this.
Mr.
Right.
Bentley, you're trying to seduce me. I mean, it was forgive me because I don't remember the configuration of Summit Point very well, but it was the big long run of the track where it goes up and over and left and out behind. And there are two big long chunky straights and a little jump and a yump. And it was cool. But that's not what we're here to talk about because the show isn't about, thank God, it's not about me because I hate talking about myself. But we're going to tell a story. You guys ready?
Yeah.
I want to hear this.
Is it is the story about the car?
No, it's
Ross,
not the
Jesus.
car. I'm just wondering. Okay.
There must be something in the water in Canada that just makes the dad humor. It rolls so strong with everyone from up north, and it makes me so happy. And yet, I love you to pieces, Ross. Okay, so like I said, we call these things centerpiece episodes. And the reason ties into a moment where I was sitting at my kitchen table last year when I was planning out this show, back when I didn't know if anyone would want to listen to or talk about the side of motorsport that has nothing to do with numbers, right? And the thing was, I wanted to do a podcast that was deeply set in the now and yet also had one foot in the past because everything that came before us inflects and colors what we do now, even if we don't realize that. And part of that is because people throughout history are all pretty much the same, right? We try, we fail, we get frustrated, we do amazing things that nobody notices, and we do boring or terrible or embarrassing things that everyone notices. Journalism. So I figured we should do this Big Lift monthly episode, trying to illustrate all that through racing. That thing that just looks like driving around in circles, but is really about who we are, how we try and fall and learn and get better often in spite of ourselves. And so as I sat there, I stared at this, we had this bowl of fruit on the center of our kitchen table because that's apparently what people do when you're a grown up. I still seems strange to me that I'm an adult, but I stared at this bowl of fruit and I thought, okay, well, centerpiece, this thing that isn't really necessary, that seems frivolous, but that, also kind of holds everything together. And I say all of this big long-winded ramble about fruit in a bowl, because this story is one of the things that holds my enthusiasm for this whole sport together. And we'll get to why much, much later. So, guys, what's the first thing that comes to your mind when you think of American racing in the middle 60s? Like the concept, like how it worked.
Raw, power,
okay.
grunt.
The noise or the torque?
I mean, Corvettes versus Shelbys.
Right.
I mean, I remember I went to Road America in that era when I was that age. Born and raised in Wisconsin, went to Road America. My dad took me and I watched Cobras versus Corvettes with, Dick Thompson and Bob Bondurant and guys like that against the Cobras, and I mean, big American iron and I don't know. I didn't think innovation, just really cool cars.
Right. Stuff that takes big arm muscles and has way too much power and no brakes and no grip and goes actually really pretty quick. So conveniently, that's where we're going. Ross, what do you think of when you think middle 60s?
So I think, what have I driven from the 60s? And I can remember, I'm going to say it was maybe early 80s when I got a chance to drive a Cobra, a real 427 Cobra.
Yeah.
And then not too long after that, I actually got to drive a real Ford GT40. So
Ooh.
I drove a couple of those things, and what I remember mostly is, how did anybody survive? And sure, some didn't, some didn't, but that was sort of my big takeaway was, wow, these things are. Take this the right way, listeners. You had to like really man up to drive those things. And
or lady up or child up or sheep up, whoever you were at the wheel, you had to do a lot of that, right?
They weren't very forgiving. They weren't very forgiving. And wow, they were tough, but also really cool.
Okay,
so you stomped on that right pedal. Boy, that was fun.
Yeah. I remember Bob Bondurant telling me personally because he drove those era cars, and we're talking about the technical side of it and what was good and what was bad. And I said, man, the power was amazing. And he said, yeah, you know what the thing that stands out though is how bad the brakes were.
Yeah.
All of those cars had horrible brakes. And he said he actually was kind of known for being able to make brakes last longer on the Corvette, I think he was driving, than other people.
So Jeff, just as an aside here, is I had dinner with Bob one night.
Yep.
And he told me that exact same story. I think it was one of Bob's, like, I'm going to pull up my storybook here. And
right. It must have been. Right. Yeah. Right. He told me that. And that was his claim to fame. He could make the brakes last longer than the other guys. And he would win races because of that, because the brakes were so horrible. Nowadays, we don't think about brakes. It's like, oh, we have steel brakes. We're going to have to change them once at Daytona. But you use them as hard as you want. It's not a thing. But back in the day, wow. So that's another thing.
So that's an interesting jumping off point, right? So we have Bondurant, a guy who like famously was known for. Let me just put it this way: I actually interviewed him before he died for this exact story, for that piece I did in Road and Track. But a guy who was known for every story that involved Bob Bondurant was at the core about Bob Bondurant. And like, bless the dude, right? Like he started one of the better racing schools in North America. Like he was a Formula One driver. He made a massive dent on the sport, right? But ultimately, it makes you think about how everything from that period, it's all, like any chunk of history is all connected by collected recollections, and nobody's 100% correct. And the real truth of what happened is somewhere in the middle of that great big woven kind of tapestry of 1,000 different narratives, right? And some of it, sometimes you read those narratives, you read books, you see movies, and you're like, that is too good to be true times 1,000. There's no way in hell it happened. And that leads us to where we kick this story off, right? Because on July 4th, 1965, the middle decade of the golden era, the last great golden era of big, gutsy, big arm muscle motorsport, on America's Independence Day, this simple, slinky, V8 powered American race car that wasn't really that revolutionary, but was also just perfectly timed for the moment. A car that is now they made 6 of them, and each one is worth double-digit millions. A car built by a handful of California hot rodders and metal shapers on an educated guess. Well, that guess was spat out by a designer who would later become famous for racing Datsuns and building hang gliders, and I'm not making that up. But that guess, that dude, that car that he built, that car clinched a title. It won America its first FIA Manufacturers Road Racing Championship ever, right? And here's the absolute bonkers part. In an age when sports car racing was an actual big deal, when it was a new thing, when every year things were changing and getting faster, and the sport was moving, just rapidly dashing toward the horizon. In that period, we did this massive thing, and very, very few people cared. So let's back up. We have this guy, one of the most well-known names in the history of American speed. He's a face on the Mount Rushmore of American racing. His name is Carroll Shelby, right? What do you think of when I say Shelby? Like the first word that comes to mind, both of you. Silence.
I'm kind of going
because you said one word. First word.
One word.
I
right.
have to do this in one word.
Complicated.
Okay.
Complicated.
Okay. Mine was going to be winning.
Okay. All right. So there you go. Like everybody knows something about Carroll. And basically he was a lot of things. He was a Texan. He was a marketer. He was a guy who would later be played by Matt Damon in a movie that was just kind of an okay movie, but also it had Christian Bale chewing scenery with this English accent, and he threw things, and he played Shelby's house hot shoe and development driver, a guy named Ken Miles, who was amazing and rad and one of my heroes. And that movie has Willow Springs Raceway in it in California, and it was called Ford versus Ferrari when it was released in America. And in England, it was called Le Mans 66. And it's ultimately worth watching, even though it's, in the end, kind of silly, right?
I thought it was good. I liked it.
Well, that doesn't make it a bad movie, right? Like there are a lot of movies that fit that transcript that are not bad. But the reason I think it's worth watching is it gets one thing right. It gives the feeling of a California race shop where everything was both deeply planned and improvised and at the same time somehow. And everyone was just busting their ass to go out and make half improvised, rad, working class stuff that they could use to go out and throw bombs at Ferrari and the elites in Europe and the rest of the world. Because the people in that shop were once California hot rodders. They'd done that before they got into racing. And that's just what California hot rodders do, right? And because of that, that brings us to the hot rod that Shelby made, right? He's the guy behind the Shelby Cobra. It's one of the, out of the pantheon of American cars, there are, if you had to pick 5 of them that define what this country does on wheels, that's pretty much it. Ross, you said you drove a 427 at one point?
Yeah. It just a monster of a car. And there was nothing like coming out of, this was at the Westwood racetrack outside of Vancouver, and had this fairly tight hairpin that went up a hill, and you'd plant your foot into it and the thing would just step out, and it was kind of like drifting, but not quite. But it was all done with your right foot. And it was just like, wow, this is awesome. Can't imagine how many rear tires you'd go through in that thing.
Jeff, you ever spend any time around one?
As a little kid, just again, as a little kid, I watched them race against the Corvettes, and it was the power was amazing, the exhaust was amazing, the fact that it had this little roll bar seemed cool at the time, and now seems dangerous as hell. I don't know what that was. It must have been a show piece, because it certainly didn't provide any protection. And it looked right. It looked like they designed the body by building the car and then pouring like hot wax over it, and it just kind of oozed down where it had to be. The body wasn't where it didn't need to be, only where it had to be to cover stuff up.
Right.
I love that.
Right.
Yeah.
So that shape, right? So the funny thing about the Cobra, that shape is so familiar. Most people have not seen. So I'm lucky enough, like Ross, I've driven a 427 and I've driven a 289. The real deal, rolled out of Shelby's shop in LA, have real CSX numbers from back then, the real thing. But even seeing a real one is really, really uncommon. Most people haven't, but almost everybody's seen the Cobra shape, because that's the funny thing about the Cobra. It was replicated and made over so many times by so many other companies. And so many of those cars had so much power and were poorly engineered and were terrifying and might have anything from some kind of sort of accurate tube frame or ladder frame or something underneath it, to Volkswagen Beetle parts, to, on the other end, there are a handful of very, very good replicas or continuation cars that are as close as it gets to the way the thing was. And the way the thing was is not the stereotype. Like the 427s, the big honky, big block cars that they made late, the comp cars, those fit the stereotype, every last inch, except for one part. If they're dialed right, they're really, really docile to drive. They're fast, and you have to be on your game. And if you're dumb with your right foot, dumb things happen. But they're they're actually, compared to a lot of stuff from the period, compared to Corvettes or Cheetahs or anything else that had gobs of power and not enough tire, and somebody was just like, here is car, shove giant engine in. They're pretty docile and friendly, and really no worse than something like an E-Type or a Ferrari GTO or anything from the period. They're a little different in driving style, what you need. But, the average race Corvette of the period, right, it was a big thing you drove with your neck muscles and you grunted, and the brake pedal took 1,000 pounds of pressure times 1,000, and every last inch of it was a muscular thing. Cobras, especially the early 289s, the ones with the small motor early on, we'll get to that, were relatively friendly things for what they were. And that was because they were, a small British sports car, started life as the AC Ace, that had a good-sized American V8 stuffed under the hood. And in the days when that engine was literally brand new, that car went up against the likes of Ferrari, and it was sorted by some of the best motorsport engineers and fabricators on the planet. Now, that story is interesting, right? Because the more you learn about it, the more you realize what we talked about earlier with history, kind of, fuzzing and defocusing every little thing that happens based on who's telling you the story. Well, the English think that they invented the Cobra, and Shelby was just like, ha, ho, here, I'll do some American wrenchy twisty. And the Americans, we know the real truth, and this is where my American is showing, but we know the real truth, which is that it was a collaborative process, and in the end, those hot rodders that worked for Shelby sorted it. It was more than just dropping the engine in and Bob's your uncle. And a lot of what happened at the time was tied to those hot rodders and how they thought. And those Shelby's shop, it was born out of this culture of speed and engineering that came into Los Angeles in the early post-war, right? So England in the modern day and for the last half century has been the home of the spiritual and in some years literal home of Formula One, right? That's largely because there were a lot of aerospace engineers who were unemployed after the war. There's a lot of industry there left over after World War II, just kind of matriculated and molded itself into the landscape that created F1, that created, a lot of modern sports car racing. And in America, we had that same thing. It was all centered in Los Angeles for a time. But what we did have at the core of that was that one dude. We had Carroll Hall Shelby, who was, like Ross said, complicated and not great in a lot of ways, but also great in a lot of other ways. And, you didn't want to get into a poker game with him or trust him to tell you the truth. But above all, he was really good at getting shit done. He was a former racing driver. He had been one of the first Americans to make money racing in Europe. He won Le Mans and an Aston Martin. He did this in sports cars in the 50s for years, and he stopped racing partly due to medical concerns. He had heart problems. He was famously, at one point, popping nitroglycerin pills during races behind the wheel. So, a lot of people hold him up. His name is on the cars, right? His name's on the Cobra. His name's on the Mustang GT350, a bunch of other stuff. He's held up as a maker of cars, but really he wasn't an engineer or a designer. And he often tended to fake that in interviews. He kind of talked around it as if he were. There are all these stories about how you really didn't want to hand him a wrench if you were smart. And none of that is to downplay the guy, because he was, above all, a deal maker, one of history's all-time greatest salesmen or pitchmen, like Harry Miller or Enzo Ferrari or Dan Gurney or a bunch of other people in his sport. His most underrated talent, the thing people never talk about enough, is his ability to spot remarkable but untapped talent and just give it room to stretch, right? So,
Sam, that's the part that I'm just kind of going, because I say he's complicated. I'm like, what was Carroll Shelby? What drove him? Was it winning, or was it,
in a sense,
I want the best deal, or
in a sense,
I want to make the most money, or
yes,
I want my name on that car that wins, and I'll take credit for it, when really it was all these guys in my shop that were really is what made it happen. But I guess in another way, was he just a really good people manager? Like, was he really good at bringing the right people together and letting them do their job? Like, that's what I'm trying to figure out, what was it that really drove him?
So it's funny, the thing you just said, all of that, every last inch of it is true. And yet, so again, for that R&T piece, and actually long before it, I got to know a couple of his guys, and I got to know one dude in particular, we'll get to in a minute, who I kind of asked that question. I was like, well, it seems like the dude's real talent was managing people, in the sense, like in the good, positive, broad sense, not in like, my middle manager wants my TPS reports and he checks in on me 5 times a day and I'm sitting here in front of the camera and he wants to know that I'm here. No, not that. Although maybe he did some of that. He ultimately was really, really good at seeing what I think, we can almost call the critical path, right? The way from A to B. And on top of that, he wanted money and he wanted to make cars and he wanted a lot of other things. But the Cobra, right? Let's get back to that.
And Sam, can I just
Oh, yeah.
he seemed like one of those guys that was just so passionate, so enthusiastic, so caught up in what he was doing that everybody else got caught up in it as well.
Yeah.
And they just like, I'm following this guy. That's not what going through their head, but sometimes there are people that are just like, I gotta go with this guy, right? And
Yeah.
and maybe that's why he was so successful.
I think it's exactly.
I mean,
go ahead.
Not to, we got to talk about the car, even though this is not about the car. But he was not unlike, right? I mean, you could ask those same questions about Enzo Ferrari.
Yeah.
Was he an engineer? Was he a salesman? Was he a manager of people? He was like I always thought of him as the American Enzo Ferrari. Shelby was kind of that guy.
Yeah, and conveniently, they didn't like each other, right? At one point, Enzo had tried to convince Carroll to drive for him for free. I think the line was something like the privilege of driving for Ferrari, right? Which, on paper sounds like, well, yeah, hell, I mean, driving for Ferrari in the 50s. Yeah. But at the time it was just like, here's this weird little fat Italian dude with sunglasses who's very grumpy, who wants me to get in his car and nearly die for next to no money. Oh, wait, no money? Yeah. Eat a shoe, guy. So he was, and it's interesting how many people in motorsport end up fitting that mold, right?
Mm-hmm.
They are so compelling that people follow them. And one of the things he used that talent for was deal making, right? So that's how the Cobra came about. And the Cobra famously has a Ford engine in it, right? It was launched in 1962, right at the beginning of the 60s. And conveniently, shortly before that, Ford had ramped up this giant marketing push for a decade. From about 1961 to about 1969, they hung the company and the brand and everything it stood for in this approach they called total performance, which meant, to make a very long story short, just throwing rail cars, just cubic metric boatloads of money at racing in every possible form. And so Shelby got in on that with the Cobra. He was wanting to make money and go racing and sell sports cars and make money and also make money. And he had pitched around town, Detroit especially, this idea of putting one of the relatively new compact American overhead valve V8s into something small and light from Europe. And this was not a new idea, right? That idea has been around since the turn of the century, since the beginning of the automobile. But Americans in particular had, because of the way the country's set up, because of the way our engineering works, we had been very good for a long time at developing big displacement engines that made a lot of power. And in the 1950s, we came up with what we colloquially kind of refer to as small blocks. And it started with the Chevy small block V8. The small overhead valve pushrod V8 was really compact, really powerful, really durable, and affordable in ways that hadn't been seen before. It was launched in 1954. Ford responded, because of course they did, and the paths were a little parallel. And, you could argue that one was caused by the other, but at the same time, Ford is Ford. It's its own company. So Ford responded with the Ford Windsor motor, which, by the Cobra's time was a 260 and a 289. And that motor was launched in 1962. Now, a side note, right? So the other thing that Ford is known for in the 60s in road racing, besides the Cobra, is what is the GT40 program. That thing that's in the Matt Damon movie, the car that won Le Mans 4 times overall consecutively in the late 1960s. And the Damon movie paints this Le Mans thing as kind of an underdog undertaking. But in reality, it was a massive, massive thing. Just years and years of development and multiple teams and car after car after car every time they ran the race. Many, many drivers, virtually every driver who was top shelf at the time in America, Europe, was hired to race a GT40 in that program at some point. And all of which is to say, right, Ford was a juggernaut. They were just massive. And they backed Shelby. Shelby sold them on the idea of putting that motor in that car. And why is less important. Just imagine tall Texan guy who doesn't look a thing like Matt Damon being really convincing. But his shop, he decides that he's going to do this. He goes around town putting the deals together. He goes back and forth to Detroit. And when all this happens, when he's gearing up to actually make it, when the deal is coming through, when he's convinced the British to send him cars, when he's convinced Ford to send him engines, he needed a place to do all this. And he ended up taking over the shop, the LA shop of another legend, a guy named Lance Revano. And his last name, that name is Reventlow. It's just fun to say and fun to spell. But that guy was for a while in American road racing, was a big ass deal. He was a road racer, but he was also chiefly the heir to the Woolworths drugstore fortune. And he had this idea of making, and I laugh only because it's so ambitious and rad and wonderful, because this was a time when no one did this. But he had this idea of making deeply competitive American sports racers and eventually Formula One cars, powered by American engines. And he hired a bunch of talented, ex-aerospace guys and hot rodders in LA to do it. And that whole program lasted several years. And those cars were very cool and smart in many, many ways, but they weren't that successful. And part of that was because they used circle track engines, right? They used Offenhausers, the engine that dominated Indy for years, that dominated midget racing for years, that was rooted in the 1920s in Harry Miller and 1,000 other things, and in the Indy 500 all the way back then. But the thing is, that's a whole other episode. And ultimately, all it really meant was that when Shelby showed up and needed a place, Revanlow's shop, his whole program, everything that he was trying to do was kind of petering down. He couldn't spend any more money. And so Shelby takes over the shop, basically says, here, I'll take it off your hands. And when he did that, he also poured it over most of the staff. So a bunch of guys who just, had shown up and made things out of aluminum, magnesium, and welded and fabricated and done all kinds of random things to go faster. Well, the next day they basically just showed up at the same place and their jobs were the same thing for a different guy. And a lot of the shop came with. One of those dudes was this absolute genius fabricator and engineer named Phil Remington. And Remington was one of those guys who's kind of been underneath the sport of American road racing for decades. He later ended up working for Dan Gurney at AAR. And so much of what he did helped move the sport forward. He was at the core of the GT40 program, yada, yada, yada. There's a tall guy who looks nothing like Rem playing Rem in the Matt Damon movie, but that's not important right now. What's important is that he was one of the bright lights of the shop. And the other light, and don't get me wrong, there were a lot of bright lights, but the other light that filters into this story that is at the core of it, that's our hero. That's the guy I went to Summit Point with. This former GM designer in his late 20s named Peter Brock. Now, Brock was actually, wait, hold on. I think both of you have met Pete, haven't you?
Oh, yes.
I've met him as a journalist.
Yeah.
But never in the engineering capacity, which was unfortunate because the guy is, well, you'll talk about him, but pretty brilliant.
but that's the thing. He was a journalist. He got to the end of his career and was like, well, I'm just going to keep going to races and keep telling stories.
Yeah.
And when I met him, he came to interview me at an IMSA race. I don't know when that was, late 90s or something like that. And I'm kind of like, Pete Brock? I mean, first of all, Pete Brock, who did this stuff with Datsun's BRE and all that kind of stuff and did all these other things. I'm kind of like, you're interviewing me? Can I just talk to you? And I remember sitting down and having lunch with him and asking him all sorts of questions. We never really spent a lot of time on the Cobra stuff, but yeah, amazing guy.
But that's the thing, right? So imagine what it takes. Imagine the kind of person who would have, by that point, how old do you think he was when you met him, Ross? Again, he was born in the 30s. So when was this?
He would have been
90s,
I'm going to say
2000s?
late 50s.
Okay.
I'm going to say it was late 90s, so
okay,
60-ish. Yeah.
So imagine the kind of person it takes who, and There's so much more we can talk about with Peter. He is a remarkable human, but he had a remarkable career. And at the end of that career, and there were several pivots in there. I wasn't kidding. Like, he had a hang gliding company. He set hang gliding distance records with stuff that he built. He was one of the largest names in hang gliding in the world. But that's not important right now. Just picture the kind of person who would do all of that. And then at the end of it, be like, well, I'm a little bored. What can I do now? I'm going to keep traveling and learning and just keep poking things into retirement age, essentially, right?
And Sam, he seemed like the most humble and nicest person I've ever met. And I'm kind of like, hey, to be in racing for that long, you got to be pretty competitive and, like, he didn't seem like that. He seemed so so California.
So funnily enough, he's from California, right? Like I said, born in the 30s. In 62, when the Cobra came out, he was 26 years old. He grew up in Northern California, in the Bay Area. He found road racing as a teenager in the very early 50s. He goes down to Monterey. And at that point, this was like 51, I believe. At that point, Laguna hadn't been built. The most permanent tracks in the United States had not been built. He's spectating public road races in Pebble Beach. And I believe they actually use 17 Mile Drive, the big kind of winding 30-mile-an-hour road that goes up and down the coast as part of the track. But he loves it. He can't get enough of it. He's a teenager. The next year, he buys a used MGTC, and things just go from there. He moves to Detroit and applies to go to school at Art Center, the design college in the city of Detroit. He's 19 years old. He goes into the building. They're like, hi, hello, yes, okay. You want to be a designer? Cool. Where's, show us what you've done. Show us your portfolio. And he's like, I don't have a portfolio. I left it in the car. Hold on. He goes back outside, sits in the car, sketches up some stuff, brings it back inside. They're like, okay, cool. Yes, please come in. You have talent. He leaves Art Center. He gets hired at General Motors. He ends up drawing a sketch that gets picked by the famed GM designer, also another famous, complicated person, a Shelby type. And not an asshole. I didn't say asshole. Can I say asshole on this show? I don't know. The designer, Bill Mitchell. Mitchell ends up picking one of Pete's sketches and likes it. And that sketch becomes the second generation Corvette, the Stingray, which conveniently started production in 1962. But again, by that point, Pete was gone. Pete had gone to California. He was working for Shelby. He moved out there looking to be a race car driver because all he wanted to do was be a race car driver. You'd be surprised how many people end up at race shops because they want to be a race car driver, even if they never end up in race cars, right? Like, I mean, Jeff, your whole career, you wanted to be a race car. The face you made was just like, right? Though
I wanted to be a race car driver. I still do. I'm just, the only thing is I became smart enough to realize that there were people a lot better than me. And the closest I could get would be to hang out with those guys and try to make them go faster. But yeah, I mean, that's the number of people. I mean, not to get too far off the topic, but the number of people that used to join Skip Barber racing schools as mechanics because they wanted to be a race car driver or work in a race team or a race shop. I mean, that was the thing. Most people in racing are frustrated drivers.
So Brock moves to California. And by this point, he has a race car. He has a Cooper. I forget what flavor it is. It has some history to it. I want to say it had a Le Mans connection to it. He brings it with him when he moves. And he ends up working at the shop of a guy named Max Balkowski, who we will do an episode on at some point because Balkowski's just rad. Did some cool stuff. But he works there for a bit. And eventually he gets a job at Shelby's, and he's hired to run Shelby's School of Performance Driving in Riverside. It's one of the first driving schools aimed at race driving in the country. And after that, on the off days, he ends up running basically Carroll Shelby Enterprises. Shelby had a Goodyear racing tire company. He had his fingers in all these other things that kind of helped keep the lights on when they weren't racing and when Ford wasn't, fire hosing money into the shop. But over the years, he did a lot of things. He ended up kind of towing into his designer background. He did the stripe package on the Shelby Mustang GT350. He tested cars. He handled PR and sales. He wrote ad copy. He laid out ads. He designed T-shirts. He would go shoot photos with journalists. And all of that was going on during the launch of the Cobra. And now the Cobra, the most famous version these days is the 427. And they're usually equipped with what Jeff was talking about, with the chrome roll bar and, comp spec side pipes and fat fender flares. This is what one of my friends, Colin Comer, is a lovely guy from Wisconsin who happens to be a Shelby Cobra authority. And his term for all of this, for that whole collection of stuff that people bolt onto Cobras that is rooted in a factory option pack of sorts, his term for that is the Pam Anderson kit, right? Because not all the cars need it. Most of them don't need giant tires and that's a little roll hoop, but they get it. And usually, that's 427s, right? And the 427 is the most violent of all of them. But all of the car's racing success came with the first engine the car got, which was originally a 260 and then very quickly became a 289. But the 289s were, again, those were small blocks. They were smaller and lighter. They were more narrow. They weighed less, period. They made around 300, maybe a little more, 300 plus, let's call it 300 plus horses in race trim. And they were too much for the car to begin with, right? The cars that came over from AC, from England, they were, again, it's an AC Ace, right? Small British sports car, little thing with transverse leaf springs in it at first. They needed help. And Shelby's people, all of them, especially Phil Remington, the genius practical engineer and fabricator, they worked overtime to change the thing and make it turn better and stop better and be more cohesive. And this meant, everything from re-engineering the frame to changing the steering gear to fixing the suspension, taking bind out of it, and then re-engineering that and changing the kinematics and all this iterative stuff that started small and then got bigger and then led to the big blocks that, the 427s had a completely different frame underneath. They had completely different suspension geometry. They were a totally different car in so many ways. But the 289, it was the weapon. And it's hard to overstate just how much of a weapon it was, how many race wins it ended up with. And part of that was just because, why does any race car win, right? At any point in history, the right car at the right time, right? Timing and classing and, so-and-so didn't have their shit together for another 3 years, blah, 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 blah. But it was ultimately just a balanced package in all ways but one. It was a barn door aerodynamically. Like, just think about what happens when you try and push a brick through the air. And that's the stereotype, but it wasn't far off.
Sam, when I think about that car, I think blunt instrument.
Yeah. Which is,
and yet with a blunt instrument, you can accomplish a lot.
Yeah.
You can overcome drag with power. Just add more power.
Right.
You can't really get downforce that way, but if you want to go 180 miles an hour with a Cobra, you just need more power than the Corvette. And you'll get there. So you can solve that problem another way. And it's kind of what maybe why that big motor ended up in it. I don't know.
Well, sort of, right? So to a point, everything you said is of course accurate because this is what you do for a living. And I basically stick my nose in books and then dick around in race cars. But the thing about the way aerodynamic drag works is that it gets, I love this word, bigger the faster you go, right? So if it takes X amount of power to go X speed with a brick, it takes far more than 2X to go 2X speed with that same brick. So Cobras, by the period standard, had a decent amount of power. The engines were relatively durable for what they did and how they worked, and yet it still wasn't enough. The car, and they tried everything, pulling windshields and slicking the thing up and just doing all kinds of things to make it slipperier. And they still petered out around 150 miles an hour. And that sounds like a lot for the 1960s, except it isn't, right? That's around 20 to 30 mile an hour slower than the fastest production sports cars in the world at the time. It's just the old story of drag and lift, right? So maybe, okay, all right. You think about it, you think, okay, well, the Cobra did so well. It must have been because American tracks favored it. They worked well, right? Yes, they did. We're talking about a totally different racing environment than even 10 or 20 years later. At the time, the average lap speed in a lot of these places, helped by the lack of brakes, helped by lack of tire, helped by lack of suspension. But the average lap speed rarely got over 70 miles an hour. And this is in comparison to places in Europe where the faster European circuits, some of those tracks had straights longer than a lot of the road courses, an entire lap of a lot of the road courses they were using in period in America, right? So, long story short, Cobras did really well in America, and then they took him even to places like Daytona, but primarily in Europe, at long big tracks like Spa, Monza, pick your place, they got outrun hard. And everybody knew they needed an answer. But, there was a lot going on at Shelby's at the time. So, have you guys been to, what do you know about Los Angeles down near the water? That string of beach communities. You spend any time down there?
A little bit, not enough.
Yeah.
So it's
Let's
Santa
just say
Monica.
that I don't hang out on Venice Beach pumping iron with those guys,
I never would have guessed.
or rollerblading with whatever, right? Yeah, that's not me.
When you say Los Angeles Beach, I think of Long Beach. Yeah, I hang out at Long Beach. I've never actually been to the beach, but I've been to the track that's
Right,
near the beach.
right.
I can see it sometimes, but no, Santa Monica, Venice. Yeah, I've been there. My kid lives there. So not there, lives in LA, and we check it out. Yeah, it's cool.
So it's dense, right? Like it's just like, the thing is, you go down there and it's some of the most expensive real estate in the country, and there is not an inch of it wasted. And what's amazing to me is that that's a relatively recent thing, like within your lifetimes, not mine because I am 12 years old, but within your lifetimes, that's changed. And Shelby's shop was in a place called Marina Del Rey. It's now called, I think it's Playa del Rey now, not sure, but I've been there. It's now tall condos and densely packed fast food joints and car dealers. And, it's not an inch wasted, right up to the water. But at the time, it was, sparse. It was a little more than a bunch of industrial buildings and fields. Believe it or not, they used to load cars into the transporters at Shelby's shop in the field across the street. And there are stories of Shelby just like testing, especially the first 427s at full whack on public roads around the shop, just like blitzing through stop signs at 90 miles an hour. And nobody cared because there was nobody there. It's remarkable because it only lasted for a few years. By the time the GT40 program got into full swing, by the time the GT350 program got into full swing, the quantities and the people and just the sheer number of man hours that had to be cranked out of that place, they were bursting at the seams. It wasn't just one shop. It was a shop and then a shop across the street and then a smaller shop. And they eventually ended up moving to a hangar at LAX, which is what you see in the Matt Damon movie, right? And there's that whole scene where, Damon goes out with a dude who's playing Henry Ford II, Hank the Deuce, the guy who famously paid for everything Ford did in the 60s. He says something, Ferrari's ass is mine, blah, 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 blah. And he goes out and he scares them on the runways and the ramps. It's probably something like maybe a kind of thing that could have possibly happened. But the point there is to give you the idea that the way that shop worked was, for all the money and the projects and the big, big stuff that came out of it, it was still at the edges, frayed and loose. And, Shelby ran it. And, occasionally you'd find somebody upstairs stooping the secretary. And then occasionally somebody would be gone because there'd be things going on and you wouldn't know why they were gone, and not everybody talked to each other. And in the middle of all this, we have our boy Peter, right? And in the middle of all this, he loves every inch of it. And the Daytona Coupe, the car that he built, the thing that won that championship, came out of that love for it. But to start that story and start with why and how he wanted to build it, we have to start with the Ferrari that it was designed to kind of take apart, the thing that ran the class that the Cobra was in, that was essentially the king dog in that class in Europe, and the few times it was raced here, same. It's a Ferrari 250 GTO. It's a race car. Mid 1960s, early 1960s, was very, very, very successful from about 1962 to about 1965. It was this slinky, long 3-liter V12 thing, made about 300 horse. It was a piece of art. And if that name sounds familiar, it's because they made, I want to say, just over 30, don't have the number handy, 36, 34. And those cars are now literally the most expensive Ferraris ever made. And a GTO was, until recently, right? It was one of the most expensive cars sold, period. And I think the record was something like $70 million in a public sale, which is not the same thing as private, right? But $70 million until one of the Mercedes 300 SLR coupes ticked it. And that's, again, a whole nother episode. I say this a lot. But the GTO was a, let's say, 170, 180 mile an hour car. It was a heavy redesign of the Ferrari 250, the GT short wheelbase coupe, essentially the last great dual purpose road and race car that A, that Ferrari built, but B, that kind of anybody built, right? It was rooted in the 1950s. It was very successful. Ferrari had strung that design along for a long time. They knew it was obsolete, but it's Ferrari. There's never a lot of money. And so it doesn't have a lot of money. He just has a lot of sunglasses, and he has a lot of clout with the FIA, the governing body that governs all of international motorsport. And the GTO was made legal. It was, again, it was a rebody, but it was also a hard rebody. There was a lot changed. But it was a rebody of the 250, and it was made legal after a 1961 rule change in what they call Appendix J. It's a section of the rules that applies to GT car. It basically just said a car is considered production if you make at least 100 examples of them. And, rebodies count as that production. And there was an exemption in there that allowed the GTO to be built. And that whole thing where you could create a new low production body on it for an existing model, well, that left the door open for doing something with the Cobra. Oh, wow. I just found the number. It's 26 GTOs made between 62 and 64. Look at me. I've got facts.
Wow.
I know. Jeff is so unimpressed. He's like, wow,
no.
gee.
I was thinking back to, I didn't realize, didn't they even call those cars J cars?
Oh, man, I don't know.
I've heard that term.
There was something about that. Yeah.
When you said Appendix J, I'm like, oh, so that's where J cars came from, because there was a, loosely they said,
yep.
Oh, that's a J car.
Actually,
so the Ferrari was a J car. This car was a J car. They were J cars. Now I know why. I'm smarter today than we was 40 minutes ago.
And that's different than the Chrysler K car.
Right. Yeah. No, we don't want to talk about that.
My dad had a K car as a company car in the 80s. And I remember riding in it. And I was like 6 years old, 7. And I remember thinking, this is a nice car. And I said something to him years later, and he looked at me like I had horns growing out of my head. And he just went, no, it wasn't. But yeah, the J car actually, now that I think about it, that's
J
where
cars was a classification under that Article J.
But the term J car is typically used for the Ford GT40, long story short, that Ken Miles ended up dying in, which was a rebody of the GT40, prototype thing he was testing later on in the 60s, yada, yada, yada. Cool thing. But again, a whole other episode. So that whole window that was open, Carol knows it's there. Pete knows it's there. Carol, it's summer of 1963. Carol goes to Pete and he basically says, hey, Pete, can you design a new body for the Roadster? Something that's going to give us more top speed? And Pete's like, yeah, okay. And like, the dude doesn't say anything else. And Pete, the word that Pete used once to describe this is oblique, right? The guy was oblique in that, foggy, mysterious. I don't know. Maybe he wants that because it's important for the company. Maybe he wants that because, I don't know, he's going to go date somebody's daughter. Like Carol was a lot of things. So Brock gets out a legal pad and he gets out some ballpoint pens. He loves working like this. He just starts making sketches and notes and ideas. And he had this idea in his head for a while, and it looked weird, the thing he drew. It was long and low, had this large arcing rear window. It looked nothing like a Cobra. It was a a fastback, but it was weird, especially at the back where the car just sort of chopped off. It was high and wide, and it chopped into this oval section. It looked flat, but wasn't. And that was the big deal with the design. Kind of looked like the tail of a standard GTO, really, but it was larger and flatter. And it was the whole width and height of the car at that point, as if somebody had just literally run it through a paper cutter. And this was a new idea, but not a new idea, right? There had been a GTO built similarly in 1962. There was a privateer car where somebody chopped the back. It was not an actual, didn't start life as a GTO, started life as a 250, a GT, short wheelbase car. Somebody crashed it, and then they rebodied it with this long, swooping, kind of boxy back end. It was short and weird and slinky. It looked like an anteater with a weird ass grafted onto it. And it had a little door in the back, like a bread oven. And the English called it the bread van. And it was mocked by pretty much everybody. And it was faster than a GTO in a lot of situations, but most people just assumed that was because it was lighter, which it was, and the weird tail was a stupid idea. And this is where we get to the really neat part, because that tail, it's the Daytona's defining thing. That chopped flat rear is what's called a cam tail. It's KAMM, and it's named after the guy who first did studies on it in automotive aerodynamics in the late 1930s. It was this German named Dr. Wunewald Kamm. And Brock had found translations of those studies while he was working at GM, these papers that said that the cam tail would actually reduce drag. And he once told an historian, I'm going to read something here. I try not to read long quotes on the show because that's not what we're here. You want to hear our gibberish, not book gibberish. But I'm going to read this because it's really just a great summary of it from Peter. He says, I was convinced that the steeply angled fastback roofline, common to contemporary racing coupes, Ferraris, Aston Martins, Jaguars, that these things would create turbulence that would diminish the car's speed. Air flowing over the boundary layer would not follow the body's lines if the roofline fell away too quickly. This air was allowed to separate from the surface at the highest point on the car, normally just behind the windscreen. It would create eddies of turbulence from that point rearward. This turbulence would in turn create drag. The car would slow down, yada, 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 right? And that's a cool line. And I mentioned it to him once because, again, I got to know Peter a little bit when I was at R&T and through other work. And he was like, oh, I found that stuff. And it just made sense. Nobody at a manufacturer had ever wanted to try it. It just looked too different to risk on a production car.
Jeff, a question for you. I mean, I know you're not an aerodynamicist, but I know you know a lot more about passing wind.
I wondered where you were going to go with that.
Passing wind than Sam and I do in some ways. Anyways, you know more about aerodynamics than we do. Air flows over something, and cars have this center section or some point where there's a driver. So it's a big bulbous area kind of thing, right? To get the air to continue to follow that, my understanding is you'd have to have this big, long, tapering rear end, like a slipstream streamliner at Bonneville, and that tail would have to be like 15 feet long or some crazy thing.
Exactly.
So the idea of this cam back thing is, and I'm also remembering as a kid getting a slot car of a Daytona Coupe and building a model, and kind of like I remember reading something somewhere where the air flows over and it's like, okay, you can have it taper off forever, or you can just go chop it off right here.
Right.
And it actually is better than trying to fix it. Like, it's just deal with it now rather than fix it, unless you're going to fix it the proper way with a big, huge, long tail. Is that kind of it? Or
yeah, I mean, that whole shape. I want to hear more about this because I haven't read the aerodynamic studies on this thing, but you would not do that today. That is not something where you'd go, oh, we're just going to end the car and just chop it off, because it creates all what you just read, Sam, is what happens. I mean, it's like, yeah, nobody does that. What you want to do is you want to fill in that area. You don't want, think about your SUV or your minivan. I mean, it's chopped off at the back, right? it sucks up all the dust and puts it on your windshield, on the back windscreen and stuff. And it's because it creates a low pressure back there, and it basically causes drag. You don't. Yeah, it's pretty interesting that he chose that. When he could have done something else.
You wouldn't do that. The cool
today.
Part, right? And that's the cool part, because history doesn't move in a straight line. It wasn't the ideal answer, but it was so much better than what came before it that it made a difference. And this is why hindsight is so rad, because you look at some of these things and be like, well, why didn't he go there? Well, at the time, nobody had a better answer for it, and this was just the next logical step, which is cool.
And again, I don't understand, but it's almost like if you try to make it smooth, and the Ferrari GTO, I mean, it kind of tried to make it smooth, but it couldn't quite do it. And the opposite approach was just, well, cut it off. And as you said, Sam, it wasn't completely flat. It was kind of almost a little concave.
Yeah.
And maybe there's like a big negative pressure thing there that so much that it actually kind of draws the air over the car. Maybe that's kind of where I'm kind of going. And I got an idea. Let's call up Pete. Let's take one of those. Let's go and buy a Cobra Coupe and let's take it to a wind tunnel and figure it out.
I like your idea, and I would think somebody may have done that, at least with a model in a scale model. It wouldn't be that expensive just to understand why that worked. And I don't know, because again, you wouldn't do that today. You wouldn't try to chop it off, but maybe the alternative was, extending it longer. I go back to, it might be better than unless you could do the alternative absolutely right. If you get the alternative slightly wrong, it's actually worse than just chopping the thing off and having that curve to it. I'd like to understand why that worked. And what's amazing to me is that I'm pretty sure those things weren't put in wind tunnels, that they just like visualized it, and Pete just kind of went, this, I mean, he's smart, and he just did it because he thought that was right. And no wind tunnels, no data, no information. It's incredible.
And I've met a couple of people. There's another engineer friend that passed away a few years ago that we know, who I remember talking to him, and he says he would look out the window of airplanes and visualize airflow. He would, as a kid, he would be driving down the road and put his head out the window and visualize airflow. I have a feeling that like Pete was kind of like one of those guys who could kind of just visualize airflow and see how things would, in their mind, be a wind tunnel.
Yeah, I've been to enough wind tunnel tests in my life where I thought I could visualize airflow and figured out and put these parts on, and gone to the wind tunnel and went, yeah, nope, that doesn't work at all like I thought. So I am smart enough to know I can't do that, but Pete apparently could.
So he doesn't know, right? At this point, he's convinced it's something. He thinks it's the path forward. He's not sure. And they take a crashed Cobra Roadster that had come from a team of a guy named Skip Hudson, which I included this name in my notes simply because, I don't know, Skip Hudson is like the most 1962 name ever. It's like, wow, it's Skip Hudson over there. That's one cool cat dude. And yeah, am I mixing slang from the 30s? Why not? Who cares? So they strip down this car. They start measuring hard points. They use it to build a body buck. They transfer those hard points to big sheets of vellum paper tacked on the wall. Pete takes the paper, walks across the street to his office, puts those points into quarter scale drawings. He starts sketching out the body lines, just fast, rough, like screw it. Working on the floor because the walls weren't big enough. Big pieces of paper on the floor. Does the windshield first. He mocks up Miles sitting in that crashed Cobra frame because the windshield is important. Miles' position is important. Miles is going to be the guy who's going to be doing all the dev work on it. And the windshield takes the most amount of time to make, right? And the whole time, everybody in the shop thinks it's the dumbest thing in the world. They think it's terrible. Remington, especially, he thinks it's a giant waste of time, doesn't look like a race car. And like Pete knows he's working with some of the best practical racing and performance engineers in the world. And the fact that those guys think he is full of it, well, he gets doubts, but It keeps going. The drawings get more realistic. They get a copy of the FIA regulations when one of their fabricators, really, really important dude named John Olson, comes back from England with the book. They tweak it and tweak it and tweak it. And there's this wonderful quote from John Morton, later become a very famous racing driver, number of things, drove with Pete. But he told me the REM thing, and they all rolled their eyes at it. But he also told me, he said, did we have any sense that it was important? He said, no. It was almost to the contrary. It was almost a pain in the neck that they had to go to the trouble of doing this while they were trying to run the roadsters. And he says that in the third person because Morton at that point was barely into his 20s. He was sweeping the floor. He was another dude who had just showed up at Shelby's shop asking for a job because he wanted to be a race car driver. He's rad. We'll do an episode on him at some point. I got so many episodes in my spleen. So meanwhile, like all this is happening on Shelby's, the whole shop they're focusing on comp Cobras. They're focusing on other deals. Like there's all this stuff going on. Shelby's office is over the shop floor, up the staircase. He's above this, literally and figuratively. And he either just like, he knows that the guys in the shop are not really behind it, but he either has a bunch of faith in Peter or he doesn't care. And the long and short of it is, in retrospect, he was either going to let Pete use that rope to save the day or hang himself. And there's this one famous exchange. Carol loved bringing celebrities and fancy people by the shop. All these pictures of like Steve McQueen there and things like that. At one point, Carol brings by this former airplane racer, a guy named Benny Howard, who at this point was 59 years old. He was an aeronautical engineer. He'd won the Bendix Trophy and the Thompson Trophy, these extremely big deal airplane races in the 1930s. And Howard looks at this and sees the coupe and all but drops his pants and slaps Peter Brock in the face with his equipment, right? He says, the tail on the car is stupid. It's going to cost them so much drag. They'll need more than 500 horses to reach 180 miles an hour. And he looks at him and he goes, if what you're saying is true, airplanes wouldn't fly. Now, Pete's like, well, okay. Have you heard of Cam? And Howard's like, whatever. And Brock's like, well, quietly to himself, well, if you're so smart, why haven't you heard of Cam? Howard tells him to fix it, right? Howard says, drop the roof line, get rid of the flat thing in the back. No fast cars ever look like that. You're a moron. Shelby takes him to lunch. Brock is not invited because, obviously. Shelby comes back and looks at him and is like, Pete, is that guy full of shit? And Pete's like, no, I think we're right. And there's this pause, Peter told me. And then he says, Carol, have I ever let you down? And Shelby's like, well, no, but... And the official quote that appears in a bunch of books, and forgive the cursing, but the official quote is, God damn it, you better be right. The car becomes real. They finish it. It's announced to the public January of 1964. It's called Daytona. The announcement says, because it will probably be introduced there. That's a direct quote. The first one, the prototype, is built at a panel shop in LA called Cal Metal Shaping in a couple of weeks. A lot of people think it was assembled in Shelby's shop, but the body came out of Cal Metal Shaping. They basically just drew it. John Olson cut it out of a bunch of plywood, screwed the buck together, and then boom, it was a car. And it's beautiful. Pete, the first time he sees it, he talks about seeing it and just standing there in the light of the shop at Cal Metal, just the aluminum clamped to the wooden buck, just glistening, just raw, all the panel marks on it, beating marks. And he later said that in that moment, he knew it was going to work. He had no reason to know, but he knew. So they trailer it back to Shelby's. The tone of the shop shifts a little, not much. Everybody's like, okay, well, cool, it's a real car. And they take it testing. By the way, we have crossed an hour on this. This is going to be one of our longest episodes ever, and I don't care. And if nobody listens to it, I don't care because I love this story so much. And if you have made it this far,
stick with us.
No, if you have made it this far, you are a peach of a person, and I will personally show up at your house and thank you and buy you flowers. And if you haven't, well, at least I get the joy of telling this on tape. So
get going, Sam. I want to hear what happens here.
Yeah.
I don't care how long it takes, but you got me on. Is this the cliffhanger or the third act? Right?
We're actually still we haven't started. Yes, we're almost done. I swear. Right. So they go testing at Riverside.
Act 3. Here we go. Act 3.
Right. Yeah, actually, technically, sure.
Right.
So they go testing at Riverside. This is February of 1964. It's like first week of February. Riverside is a racetrack out in Not quite the desert, but also the desert. Now it's a shopping mall. It's basically an LA exurb. Riverside is gone. It was torn down. But back then, it was in the middle of nowhere. That was where Shelby had his driving school, right? So they take it there. Daytona is that same month, but it's not just that same month. It's 2 weeks away, and they're going to run it there. They haven't driven this thing at all. It's got a 289 chassis underneath it. They know it's basically a 289, but they have no idea what the body's going to do. They go test it, and they use the big course. And Ken Miles, again, Christian Bale, which is just the weirdest thing because you watch that movie and you're like, is that a real accent? Is that what Miles sounded like? I don't know. Is he selling it? I don't know. Batman has feelings. So they go testing. Batman is in the car. I'm just going to keep calling Miles Batman. That seems disrespectful. Batman. No, he's a hero. Okay. They go testing. It happens. Pete's back at the shop. The next morning, there's not much talk about it. Pete finds Miles. He's like, what happened? How did it go? And Miles is in a hurry. He has all these things to do. He doesn't have much time. And Pete just has all these questions. He's like, well, how did it work at speed? Is there lift? Like, well, actually, I knew there was going to be lift, but at what speed was the lift? And how did this work and that work? And Miles is just like, yeah, Pete, fine. It's good. It's better than I expected, especially the first time out. And Peter's like, well, more. I mean, can you tell me the thing? And finally, Miles is just like, look, Peter, we broke the lap record, which we set by 3.5 seconds. And the thing is, Miles, there's this great story about how Miles came back from Riverside from that test, and he didn't believe how fast they were going. And so he had John Olson, the same guy who built the Buck. Oh, let me back up. Pete comes down into the shop one day. He sees Olson working under the coupe, the prototype. This is his baby, right? He's under it. It's up on stands, and Olson is doing something under it. And he's like, well, what's going on? One of the other guys tells him, Miles asked Olson to yank the diff out of the car, the rear gear, check the teeth. And he asked him to count the gear teeth to double check the ratio in the diff. Because at that point, they figured out the top speed the car was running by looking at the tach, multiplying by the rear end ratio, like RPM times rear ratio times, diameter of the tires. Boom, you figure out how fast the car was going. And it had been running a given number, this miles per hour number that Miles thought had to be wrong. He thought it was too fast. He thought they got the calculations wrong because they had screwed up which gear was in it. He thought that it couldn't have been going that fast. It must have been going slower. They must have the diff wrong. Must have it, blah, blah, blah. The gear's not right. It turns out it wasn't. Everything's right. They show Miles the teeth, and he's like, no. And he counts them. He sits down and actually counts the ring gear and the pinion and counts the teeth on it. And then he turns and just walks away without a word. Because the car, I remember, a Cobra tops out at like $140, $150, depending on how much horsepower it's got. The Daytona, with the same motor, same frame, had been doing 183 miles an hour down the back straight. And that's when they knew that it worked. And you have to think about, like, can you imagine what went through Peter's gut when that happened? I mean, I think about that. Nobody believed the dude except the one guy who gave him the ability to do it. And that guy basically said, well, also you might screw yourself, in which case, and I'm Carroll Shelby. Like, what do you think that must have felt like?
Yeah, there had to be a I told you so moment in there. But what I know of Pete and my experience talking to him is like, he would never have done that. He just would have been quiet.
Yeah.
I would think, and not really knowing Pete, I talked to him. He interviewed me for a technical thing on a sports car once, but I would think there would be very little of that. Oh, I'm glad I'm right and all that. I would think he would be just, yeah. I mean, that's engineering. I did the math. I read the study. That's what I expected. And so there's no celebrating. That was the result I expected, and I got that result. So cool, but nothing spectacular here because I knew that was going to happen. On to the next thing. How can we get 2 more miles an hour out of it? Or how can we do this? I'm just guessing because of the super smart race engineers and design engineers that I know, that would have been their take on it. It was like, we didn't do anything that we didn't expect to have happen. Here's the numbers. Here's the studies. Here's what my gut told me. So I expect, if it would have gone 168 miles an hour, that would have been disastrous. And then he would be all worried about it and stuff like that. But the fact that it did what he expected it to do, yep, check, move on.
That's exactly who the guy is. The first time I met him, I was prepared. I was like, holy shit, it's Peter Brock. And I was prepared to be like, oh, hi, I'm a person you've never met. I'm a fan of yours. I also think this is rad. How are you? And I didn't get that out because he was like, oh, Sam, oh, man, it's an honor to meet you. I love your writing. And my jaw hit the floor, and then my teeth hit the floor, and then my mouth hit the floor. And I'm sharing that not to say, well, Peter Brock thinks I'm a good writer, because clearly I'm not. It's a bunch of gibberish on the page. But the fact that like that's how he carries himself. He was, every time I've ever seen him meet anybody, it's like it's a gift that he gets to meet somebody, because he's just deeply curious and friendly and open. So the great forcing function in this period, right? That car pops out, they test it, $183 at Riverside. It's Ford. Ford is the one pushing the money for this. And the big hinge point on this entire story is the GT40 program, which was going simultaneously at this point. It was eventually run by Shelby, but at this point it was not. They'd been funding it, and the first ones were built by Lola. The design evolved massively. And early on, remember, this is early 1964. They were a hot mess. It's going slowly. Ford is like, and they need something to tout and something to get public eye on the fact that the GT40s are just kind of sucking a whole bunch of wind. So they laser focus on the FIA GT program, the Cobras, and that becomes the most important thing they've got. They want the Daytonas to just fill in the gap. And so Shelby is expected to have this full team of cars racing in Europe by May, 4 months away. And so at that point, Shelby shifts into Shelby mode. He starts doing what he does best, which is just deals. He starts calling in favors. He calls Alejandro de Tomaso in Italy, as in Tomaso the company, as in like de Tomaso Pantera, as in a whole bunch of other things. He had met him. The two guys had met through Formula One and sports car racing. And he calls de Tomaso and asks if there's anybody that could just churn out coupe bodies, like coach builders. And it turns out he ends up arranging with a coachworks called Carrozzeria Grand Sport that was only around for about 10 years, from 1957 to 67. It was founded by a couple of Italians who had worked at coach builders that had supplied Ferrari and Maserati. And the plan is that they're going to modify and prep the race chassis in California, air freight them to Italy, where they'll be fitted to bodies. And remember, these are Cobras, which meant their basic frames, their chassis, were being built in England at AC, then shipped to Shelby. So they were going to be flown across the Atlantic twice before they got bodies, the Daytonas. And this seemed really stupid on paper, but it actually ended up being cheaper than getting anybody to do all the work in the same place. So those cars are commissioned, that stuff starts. And it's 1964, it's February. That first prototype they take to Daytona to run 24. There are 9 Cobras in that race. And they take the prototype, the Cal Metal Shaper car, the one that Brock had stared at. It's bonkers. It's a weapon. They know it's really fast. It's the only really competitive Cobra there, right? It has so much in reserve that they run around in practice with a lowered rev limit. They didn't want to use up the car, even by the standards of endurance racing of the day, right? Which is use like 7 or 8 tenths. But they run around with a lowered rev limit, and they break the damn lap record, right? Ken Miles, Christian Bale Batman, calls Pete, and he's like, Pete said that all of his like English reserve and calm was just gone. Like he's just stoked. Like he's like, we're faster than Ferraris, Pete, much faster. And it doesn't sound like Miles. He's not prickly. He's not like pokey. He's happy. Daytona goes, it's awful. On about lap 155, diff pump fails. There's a fuel spill in the pits. John Olson, same guy who crawled in the car with the diff, built the buck. He's under the car dealing with diff, and the fuel spill, there's fire. He gets covered in flames. A 250 GTO wins. Nearest Cobra is in 4th. It's a roadster. It's 16 laps down, right? And yet Ferrari's worried. The Daytona word has kind of gotten out. They take the cars. Shelby takes the car, Sebring. And there were bits of protest, right? Ferrari protests the Daytona on a technicality. They have to change the exhaust, yada, yada, yada. But and they try to get the FIA like spit it out of the class, and it doesn't work. And Peter later said, at this point, Enzo knew that that we were coming for him. Like he didn't say it that arrogantly, but the dude knew. So Daytona goes to Sebring, wins Sebring in class. It's 4th overall. It's Dave McDonald and Bob Holbert, who but Al Holbert's dad, right? The next 3 cars in the class are Ferrari prototypes, like Le Mans cars. A Cobra Roadster, co-driven by Dan Gurney, finishes 10th, and because Sebring is relatively slow, aero isn't as important there. It matches the speed of the Daytona Coupes, that Roadster, but the race is a hinge point. And Shelby is leading in the points in class. And that whole thing ended up being like, okay, well, boom, snap. Ray Geddes, the guy at Ford, had been controlling all the money. He's in the Matt Damon movie, although he's kind of portrayed as an evil dude and really kind of shitty. Like, he wasn't that in person. In reality, he was a champion for the program, for Shelby. He makes it happen. And he pulls the trigger at that point. He just unilaterally makes the decision to finance like all of this European campaign. A week later, they announced the European campaign. And the thing is, this was an incredible bummer for Pete, which sounds funny, but he knew that that meant that the car, as a design study, the evolution, was finished. It was just the cheapest way to make a winner at this point. And Shelby's instincts and Ford and, everybody looked at it and he knew they weren't going to spend any more money on it. He was happy they were racing it, but the guy who made that thing had questions he wanted answered, and he was curious, and he chased things. And so there was a little part of him that was just like, oh, hell. But they needed that team in Europe, right? 6 Daytonas were built, the prototype from Cal Metal Shaping, the other 5 from Crossery Grand Sport. And if you ever see these things in person, and I've stood next to them at Goodwood when they were all assembled there, they got together. They haven't been together very often since the beginning, but they were all at Goodwood for the revival, the historic event. I think it was like 7 or 8 years ago. And they're all different. Every single one of them has slightly different lines. One even has a taller windshield by like 25 millimeters. The roof line is different because somebody in California screwed up and hard points moved around and the Italians just kind of had to fix it. But they all look the same. And when you see one in person, you see it and you think, okay, yeah, that's a Daytona Coupe. And then you get them all side by side and it's like somebody it's like reality just starts to melt because it's the same shape, and yet some of them aren't symmetrical left to right. Some of them aren't symmetrical in plan. Like, they're just different. And it's a weird little shocker if you know anything about that period and people, because California hot rodders are known, like especially in that period, are known for being perfectionists, right? Like the Scarabs that Rem and that whole crew turned out for Reventlow were extremely well finished, and just the whole standard of fabrication work there is like, it's like the weather in California, which is, about as perfect as you can make it in the time you have. And maybe sometimes a little more perfect than that. And all of that was hung on the whole Italian panel beater thing. And we have to take a detour into this for a second, just because it's super cool. And it's so evocative of the differences in the two countries, right? So Italy's car building industry at that time was just not prehistoric, but the smaller the company, the more raw and weird and like back barn it got. And Brock sees this when he goes to Italy in May of '64. He goes check on the builds just to visit the coachwork, visit the shop and see how they're doing. He's there for a couple of weeks. Now, remember, Grand Sport is in Modena and Ferrari is in the town of Maranello. Now, this whole chunk of Italy, it's compact and farmland and there's mountains on the edge of it, but these places aren't very far apart. Maranello is a village. I've been there. It's small, it's funky. And these days, it's basically just a suburb of Modena. It's about 10 miles away. But in the period, it was still, it was like some country roads and then 10 miles away. And the long and short of this is the American cars that were ultimately going to hand Enzo his ass were being built in the grumpy old meatball's backyard, which I just love so much. So Brock goes there and he says, like, small town America, right? Quiet streets, lots of trees. And he's flabbergasted because everything there, even stuff they would buy off the shelf at home, is being made by hand, like standardizable stuff, like trunk latches. He's there for, again, a couple of weeks, and he sees dudes just hammering out metal by hand, panel beating. Like in California, they had built everything with aircraft tools, stuff like sheet metal brakes and English wheels. And in Italy, they were doing it with shot bags and body hammers, like basically the way people had built coachwork in the 1800s. And the young guys, the apprentices, were apparently, like, he mentioned this at one point, and I had to double take and ask him again. He was like, yeah, I walked in at one point and there was a dude just sitting on a stump, like with the panel over his knee on a stump in the shop. And I was like, tree stump? He was like, yeah. And he saw dudes welding aluminum without goggles. Like the apprentices didn't have goggles because they hadn't earned them yet, just squinting. And it blows his mind. And he's like, they had brought a bunch of expensive shop tools, like the same stuff they used back in LA, packed it up, crated it, shipped it over, wrapped it up, sheet metal tools, an English wheel. And the Modenese guys, they didn't use any of it. He just boxed it up, just sat there gathering dust. And every time he came back, it was all sitting there. And he kept asking if they wanted it, and they kept hammering stuff out by hand. And that it's just this wonderful little piece of icing on this car, this unlikely car and this unlikely moment that shouldn't have happened the way they do, because every single one of those cars, and again, you stand next to them and if you want to, you can start focusing on the flaws. And yet each one of them is perfect in the way that the Mona Lisa's smile is perfect, right? It's imperfect and human and there, and it's cohesive, and you don't care about all the little things that aren't right with it because the whole is right. And he later, there's a quote in one of the books I've got where he's talking about how the Italians actually fixed the design that he spat out. Their eye was just naturally so good that there were a bunch of imperfections and like just geometric like things that didn't quite, like stuff that works on the page that didn't quite work in reality. And the Italians just kind of fixed it. So, ultimately, the stuff that came out of Grand Sport is a little more resolved and just a shade. I mean, if you were an asshole, you'd say it's just a shade prettier than the prototype, but it's not. It's just more make the hand gesture, right? Ross, waving your hand. What's
you
up?
Say it's prettier, and so I don't know when the first time I saw Daytona Coupe.
Yeah,
but I'm gonna say I was like somewhere in the 10 to 12-year-old range, and I ended up getting a Daytona Coupe slot car and a Cheetah, which was kind of somebody's version of the Chevrolet version of it.
Yeah,
without
in a way,
cam
squooshed.
back.
Right.
Yeah, and I can just I don't know what it was, but like I'd look at that car and go, it was just a pretty shape. And I forget who, some designer said at one point in time that, if a race car is ugly, it's not going to be fast. Like some point, and yeah, we've seen some ugly race cars be fast, but there was just something about it that it is pretty. And the shape of it, just as a 10 or 12-year-old kid, it was like, wow, that was just, it blew my mind. It just made me feel good. It was one of the things that made me who I am today. And I thank Pete for that.
That car was cool. I had the Cheetah. I think I had the slot car too, the HO scale slot car, but they also made a Hot Wheels car, the Cheetah, but I don't know if they ever made a Daytona, Shelby Daytona.
I had the one, I had 1/32 scale slot cars.
Oh, the bigger ones.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Okay.
I think they were made by Cox or something, or Eldon or something. I can't remember. Yeah.
Mine were like the little Hot Wheel size. I think HO they call them. But anyway, I mean, that car was, the shape of it. When you said, somebody says that ugly cars don't go fast, it's there's something to that. But I think some of the of the beauty of the car comes from how fast it goes. You know what I mean? And that car had both, which is cool. I mean, you could look at it. You didn't even have to know how fast it was going to go. That car looked great. And what's great about that is there was no wind tunnel designed it. And apparently, Sam, right? There was no like clay mock-ups, a big chunk of clay, and the guy starts hewing it out. Pete just drew it on the back of a napkin or something, and there it was. I mean, that's freaking amazing.
So
it's so cool.
And again, I think, coming from the Cobra Roadster, which, well, like I said, I mean, it's pretty as well. I mean,
Mhm.
it's got great shape, but it is the blunt hammer. You
Right.
know, it's the blunt instrument. It's
Instrument,
just
yeah.
it's like we're just gonna beat the air to death, right?
Right.
And yet the Cobra went, oh, we're gonna finesse ourselves through the air.
Right.
So
That's so cool.
So, so they get built, right? Those 6 cars are built. They go racing in Europe. Shelby contracts with some American drivers, guys like Bondurant, a dude named Alan Grant, Dan Gurney, a handful of others. And 4 of them are just essentially handed off to this English road racing team run by a fairly famous touring car and rally car specialist, Ford specialist named Alan Mann. Ray Geddes, the Ford money guy, had basically figured out that the cars could be kept there in Europe longer and for lower cost if they just lent them to Mann. And Mann was like, clearly into it. They sold all of their Ford Rally team gear to finance the season. And they start running them and they break and they do well and they break some more and then they do well. But when they work and nothing goes wrong, they don't just do well. It's sweet baby Jesus. They are fast because, again, Pete was right. They go to Le Mans and Gurney's Gurney laps at this time will mean nothing, but it's in my notes, so I just have to say it because I'm curious how that compares to a modern time. Gurney laps at 3 minutes and 56 seconds. It's the fastest GT lap ever at Le Mans. It is only 2 seconds slower than the qualifying time that David Piper, another famous driver, ran in a Ferrari 275 LM prototype, and it's 3/4 of a second slower than Richard Atwood, who would later win Le Mans for Porsche in a 917. But it's 0.7 seconds slower than the fastest GT40, which A, shows you how fast Daytona was, and B, shows you where the GT40 wasn't at that point. But they win the GT class at Le Mans. They're 4th overall. They gain a bunch of points. It's a turning moment in the championship. Not one GT40 finishes that race. And guys talk about, like, Gurney talks about the fact that he'd just sit there on the straightaways waiting for people to pass him and nothing would happen. And that it was right up to the speed of the prototypes. They were timed at more than 196 miles per hour on the Mulsanne. At 4:00, and this is with problems, right? Bondurant was convinced till the day he died that if I hadn't had a mechanical, it would have won. Like 4 in the morning on Sunday, Gurney comes in and there's a crack in the oil cooler. They had to drop RPM by drop rev limit by like 500 RPM. They had to slow down, and it's one of those moments where you look at it and you're like, well, if they had won, how would that have changed how Ford ran the rest of the decade and the things? And it probably wouldn't have. But still. So they keep racing it, right? They go to Spa. Phil Hill drives it. He complains that, Spa, which is a big up and down track, there's a lot going on. It's not just, a long, flat straightaway, big, fast, weird. Phil Hill gets out of it, American. He is one of America's, to date, he's one of just 2 world champions we've turned out. The other's Mario Andretti. But Phil drives it. And Phil comes back in and he's like, the nose of the car is a little unstable. Brock had wanted, when they designed the car, he had wanted to put this big complex wing on it. Remington had talked him out of it. Rem is there at Spa and he's like, oh shit. So he gets out some welding rod and they had like this sheet aluminum they were using for small fixes that they had bought for just minor repair work. And so Rem just, bends up some sheet aluminum and then braces it with welding rod and then tacks the welding rod to it. And Hill comes back in. He's like, yeah, it's better. And he hangs the car on the pole. And Brock later said that one change made the car the world champion, which is a neat line. Who knows what it means? But it didn't happen that year. They had a good season. The cars finished second to Ferrari in the chase by just 6 points. The GT40 is still kind of a pile. Fun, weird trivia side. It's being handled by the majority of the efforts being handled by a guy named John Wire, who runs a team that would later, Wire later ran GT40s after, because the GT40 was handed to Shelby, and then Wire ended up being one of the teams that ran it after Shelby sorted it. But Wire also ran the 917s that won Le Mans in Gulf livery. But side note, dorky, sorry. We're an hour and a half in. Oh my God, we're never going to do this again. I love this so much. So, 1965. Wait, what? Yes.
Sam, can I just,
please?
When you're talking about Remington, like tacking these things on, you kind of picture something like, somebody's come out of Home Depot and got some,
I mean,
I think everything that Remington did looked like artwork.
yeah.
So like this guy was a
Artist.
one of the greatest. Yeah, he was a fabricator who was an artist.
Yeah.
So
and famously, like the dude was MacGyver, condensed, cubed, squared, concentrated. All of the stories hang on him being like, well, hell, we don't, or in Gurney's shop being, people saying, well, we don't have this. And somebody goes, go find Rem. And they find Rem, bring Rem back. And he's like, you're being very stupid. Do it this way. And everybody like, God, Rem, why are you going to be Rem? And then he was right.
And today, when you said that, he got out some welding rod and some sheet metal and he fabricated. I thought about that. You could walk up and down the IMSA paddock at the next race.
I know what you're going to say. It's great.
And 98% of the trailers wouldn't have a welder.
Right.
They wouldn't have welding rod, and they wouldn't have sheet aluminum. They wouldn't even exist. If somebody said, hey, you walked up into the guy next to you and said, can I borrow your welder? They'd go, what? We don't have a welder.
What do you need?
You want to borrow our? You want to buy
to fix the hauler, the transporter?
Right. Did the tailgate break? What do you need that for?
The cool
it wouldn't even exist.
So cool. Other cool thing about Rem, side piece of trivia. So when Shelby's shop came apart, he ended up going over to AAR to work for Dan Gurney, right? And Gurney, everything that Gurney did from that point on, all the IndyCar programs, the Toyota GTP programs, all the way up to like AAR's shop, effectively built, kind of sorted, kind of built, kind of sorted the Delta Wing, Nissan Ben Bowlby design, the big Ace and Gary penis-looking car, right? All of that, and a whole bunch of other secret government contracts that went through AAR that they won't talk about. But Rem was doing that stuff until the day he died, and it was I want to say 10 years ago that he kicked off. But he was still coming to the shop like 5-6 days a week. So 1965, right? The season ends. They're like, okay, well, we got very close, won some stuff, cool. All right, GT40 is still sucking wind. The single most critical moment in this whole story happens, and it is a gut punch. So the GT40, the top shelf kind of tip of the spear prototype that Ford had just hung epic boatloads of cash on, the one that Daytona had walked. Ford looked around and decided that Wire, who again, deeply competent guy, but he had not managed to sort the car as people hadn't sorted the car. Wire wasn't cutting it. They gave the program to Shelby and say, fix it. And when that happens, everything in Shelby's shop hard pivots. And it's like every last man, woman, and child in the ship that is not on some other deeply critical program, which is a lot, they are aimed at it. And that includes Remington. That includes all the drivers they could spare. And that program turned out well, right? As the great Saint Matt Damon has shown us, they won Le Mans. Yada, yada, yada. But it meant that Pete's little design experiment with maybe the most American sports car hot rod genius pile rad little wonder that was ever built, it meant that was over. And the GT40, that all-out war with the clock ticking, took front burner. Miles wasn't a fan of this. Miles famously his story is so cool. And if you have any time at all in the next, I don't know, rest of your life, do yourself a favor and read some of it, because he famously was, it was a series of wrong place, wrong times, from how he nearly won Le Mans, but didn't due to politics, driving for Shelby. He was in the car, and how it happened all the way up to the way he died. But the cool thing about Miles is that he knew, right? Miles was convinced the Daytonas were faster than the GT40s. And that may or may not have been true. Probably really wasn't. You think about what the GT40 was, how small it was, where it carried its weight, suspension geometry, 1,000 other things. But Miles goes out on a limb, builds up a Daytona with GT40 brakes and an engine for testing, and he almost gets away with it, except Remington discovered the plot and basically tattles on him, shuts it down. Because A, that wasn't where the money was going, but B, Ford was done. They didn't care about the car. They wanted the GT40 to win. That was the thing. But in Europe, the Daytona, it just keeps going. It gets no development, very little budget. It's almost an afterthought. It's our hometown hero, our 250 DTO, but it just keeps running. And with a few speed bumps, right? Le Mans in 65 is an absolute disaster. 2 of the Daytonas entered, the 3 cars entered. DNF, one is a head bolt failure, one is a clutch failure. The clutch comes apart in such a way that the whole motor comes apart. The vibration damper tries to compensate. The whole engine shakes apart. Alan Grant told me that they got about 8 or 10 hours in, and it was like, oh, yeah, fine. Because, again, there wasn't a lot of money, and the motors, it's not like at that point people didn't know how to build Ford small blocks that didn't come apart. It was early in its development, but these weren't common issues. There was some grumbling about whether Mann's team had, done enough work to prep it, whatever you want to go. But the rest of the year, oh, man. The rest of the year. So car wins just one race in the FIA GT class it's in, the Division 3, over 3 liters. And that's Daytona, the first round. There are 20 rounds around the world, but the points just start adding up because it just keeps finishing and it does well, just hammering away, doing that American car thing where it just keeps showing up. And it wins the 1,000-kilometer race for sports cars at the Nürburgring. It wins Monza. It wins Sebring. It wins Enna. And it wins this one event during the Tour de France. And finally, it wins the 12 hours of Reims. Wait, no, it didn't. I'm sorry, I read that wrong. I forgot about that. I'm embarrassed. There are like 3 people who will listen to that and really hate me for it. And I know them. They're friends. Oh, I'm sorry, guys. So they didn't win. But Reims is where they clinched the championship. And Reims is a funky, rad place in itself. It's gone. It was in France. It was this track made up of closed public roads, 2-lane public highways. And if you can still see bits of the grandstand, you drive down, I forget what the auto route number is, but you drive down it and it's there. And it's just concrete sitting there on this long stretch, this narrow 2-lane. And so much of Reims was like everything else in period, between trees and places where if you crash, you are dead. And remember, that's a 12-hour race. It's around 600 miles. At that point in history, the race wouldn't last much longer. They only got a few more years. But at that point in history, the winner was averaging around 120 miles an hour. And the Daytonas were doing more than 160 miles an hour on the front straight past start finish. Peter talked about it. He was there. He was standing there. And he said that, exactly what you'd expect. You sit there and the noise, and then in between those 2 concrete bleacher sections that are still there, just this explosion of noise. And what it must have felt like for that guy, I can't imagine. So one of the cars in that race was driven by a French guy named Joe Schlescher, who would later go on to F1. The other was Bondurant, the American sports car guy, and founded the driving school, yada, yada, had some time in F1. The other Daytona had Brits in it, had Jack Sears and John Whitmore. And they were all really quick. They were all about the same pace. And I'm going to do the thing that, again, I try not to do here, but I want to read you a quote from one of the Daytona books. This one comes from Charlie, I'm going to screw up his last name, Charlie Agapou, is Agapou. I met him once. He now runs an independent Rolls-Royce shop in LA, but he was one of Shelby's mechanics. And so the Whitmore Sears Daytona at Reims, it has engine trouble. And Agapou says, at Reims, when the Whitmore and Sears came in, Alan said, I want you guys to look like you're working on this car. I'm going to hold it in the pits until the race is almost over, and I'm going to send it back out to finish. And Agapou says, we pulled the pan off, the oil pan, took a look, and then we pulled the connecting rod out because it was just hanging there. One of the rods was just loose. Like loose because things had broken. We put 2 bearing caps in the crank journal, keep the crank in, put the oil pad back on, and said, let's run it. Alan Mann, who was not a stupid man and was familiar with 1,000 things in rallying and, press on regardless type stuff, he's astounded, Agapou says. And the car finished the race on 7 cylinders. It ran for most of the race in that condition. And they get back into the race 20 laps down. But the idea was at this point, they were so close to clinching the title on points. Ferrari was real close. They ended up, it was a run, and they figured if they could keep the second car running, they'd still have a chance at the points if Bondo's car came apart. And the next morning, when the race ends, the Daytonas are the only 2 cars left running in their class. It was the morning of July 4th, 1965. It was the first major international sports car championship won by an American car. And this tells you so much, this next fact. But Carroll Shelby wasn't there. He was in LA when it happened. He was working on other projects. He didn't see it. There was this big party after, this victory party at a hotel in Reims. I asked Peter what it was like once. And, there's a quote in the book where he's like, it was fantastic. It was amazing. But I asked him what it was like. And he just kind of got this far off look in his eyes. And there was this warm smile. And he went, mm-hmm. And it was the coolest thing because you knew that in that moment, he felt probably about as good as a human can feel when they've been proved right. So Brock wanted to keep going. He had wanted to evolve the car. There's a thing that he drew up called the Type 65. There was a buck for it. They eventually finished it. It wasn't finished in period. It was this longer, lower, wider, basically what you guys were talking about earlier, this longer, lower, wider, lower drag thing. I gotta be honest, it's not Pete's best work. It wasn't as loved as Daytona. It wasn't as good looking. Again, it sat for years, but it was this moment where you know that the clock was ticking, right? Mid-engine cars were the next step, and they were just around the corner. Not just the GT40, but from Ferrari and literally everyone else. And the Daytona hit that in this last window where people were racing on public roads, where you could come up with something in a back room and it would work. And that just hits me somehow. I don't know how, right?
Sam, it makes me think that if they had built 100 of the Daytona Coupes,
yeah,
and it had been run for a bunch of years, we wouldn't be having this long podcast episode.
No.
It's kind of like what made the Beatles is because they stopped.
Yeah.
They're different than the Rolling Stones.
Right? There are, and that's not to take away anything from the Stones, right? Because like you watch Jagger and Richards and like, shit, man, I can't do that now, much less at 90 million years old. But there is something about those moments in time where a certain thing is possible and it actually happens and everything's working against it and the door shuts. So as those 4 cars that Man ran, they sat there for so long that Man eventually, like Shelby was just deep hardcore into the GT40, right? Such a focus. It was massive. They sat there in Man's shop for so long that Man eventually, like, he can't get a hold of Shelby. Eventually just finally gets the dude on the horn and is like, take these cars or I am going to push them into the ocean. And in 1966, back in LA, they're all offered for sale. This will tell you how much A, people cared for old racing cars, and B, how much people cared for Daytonas. But they're all offered for sale at this famous clearinghouse that Shelby ran. They call it the garage sale. Clearing out the shop, you could buy all 6 of them for $24,000 in 1966. Now, keep in mind that, like, I don't remember exactly, but I want to say like an E-Type Jaguar was like half that cost. And yet over time, they became these legendary things. Some were stashed away. Record producer Phil Spector, the guy behind all the Wall of Sound girl groups in the 60s, he famously drove one on the street and it was lost for decades. It was hidden in a California storage unit, rotting. There was a murder surrounding it. And all of those things are now worth millions and millions and millions, except it's hard to say because they don't change hands. The last real one that sold was in 2009 for $7 million. And that's a very long time ago by the standards of the values of old race cars. And I don't even know how to begin. I probably should have called somebody and asked before we did this. But you think about that, and you think about everything that happened and how it all came about. And the fact that it also didn't happen in America again for a long time. I want to end on a quote from Pete, who is, above all, again, the dude is just a wonderful human. Curious, he does not live in the past, and yet he has every right to. He's thoughtful, he's kind, he's creative, and he would go on. The crazy thing is, this is not the highlight of the guy's career in racing. There is so much more. I could pull another 10 2-hour episodes out of this just talking about Peter. But he had this line that was so great, so tied to how you can pull so tied to so much of the sport and how human it is and how romantic, and yet how in the end it just comes down to a simple cause and effect, and whether ideas and work and people and trying add up. And that's as steeped as I am in the romance and the humanity of all this, and how, the big, fuzzy, wonderful, like I want to give it a hug side of racing that has nothing to do with numbers. I also love that in the end, it's just black and white. It's this easily defined thing, but it is this thing you can impact or sway for the better if you care a lot and if you try very, very hard. Unlike so much of the rest of life, right? So Pete said, race cars are much closer to aircraft than they are to production cars in many, many regards. And it's probably why I have a greater affinity for aircraft than automobiles. He said, if you have a better idea and it's done right, the car is fast, you win. If it's wrong, you lose. Life is so simple in racing. I love that. That's the guy in a nutshell. An hour and 50 minutes. Oh my God.
That's a great quote.
I'm sorry. Thank you guys for listening.
No, that's really. I was going to. No, I shouldn't go there, but.
Oh, no, go there. What is it? Do it. Say it. Be Jeff Brown, undiluted.
That is why so many people are in racing, to be able to do that. And it's what modern racing, the homologated spec type racing, lacks.
Yeah.
Because you can't take your GT3 car and be at Spa and need some more front downforce and just have Phil weld you up a front wing for it and bolt it on there and go. You wouldn't get out of pit lane before the officials stopped you, and that's the sad thing. And that's why it's so cool and why it was worth spending an hour and 50 minutes and counting talking about it, because you can't do that anymore. You can't do what Pete did. It is impossible to do nowadays.
But I love what he said also is racing is simple. There's kind of you win, you lose. That's it.
Right.
So whatever you do, that's it. And I'm pretty sure if Pete was running a team today, he wouldn't be thinking about what happened back then.
No.
He'd just be, what do I got to do now? So yeah,
exactly.
Incredible.
Well, on that note, that is all we've got. That's our show. And if you made it this far, drop me an email and I will personally thank you. Drop me a DM. I don't know. Find me on the street and slap me in the face for wasting your afternoon. It doesn't matter. This made me so happy. Thank you guys for listening. Once again, our sources on this one, we used a number of places, but primarily this episode draws from the research I did years ago, which includes more books and published interviews and interviews I conducted personally with Peter Brock and Dan Gurney, John Morden, many others, but more pieces of research than I could name here. So I'll just say, man, it was a lot of fun to dive into this. And on a related note, because it sounds like fun, as a special piece of bonus content on the day this episode airs, we'll release on our Patreon my notes from my day driving that tool room copy, the Daytona, at Summit Point with Peter Brock. He was there. There's quotes from him. There's literally the line where he makes fun of me, and also, just the rest of my gibberish that I promise you is not understeer in turn 4. It's mostly just like banging my fists against the keyboard like a monkey because I can't describe so much of what happens. And because it sounds like fun, I'll probably sit down. Yeah, I will. I'll sit down and read those notes for a free bonus episode for the main It's Not the Car podcast audio stream. And now, without further ado, at 1 hour and 52 minutes, it is time to read us out. Gentlemen, you have anything else before I do that?
Thank you, Pete Brock.
Yeah.
For making our world better.
I think
that was cool.
I think that needs to go on a shirt. I'm going to write that down right now. Thank you, Pete Brock. Merch is coming. People have asked about it. We're going to make it. It may not be great because I'm designing it and I'm not a designer. So it will be...
We should get Pete to do it.
Let's get Pete to do it.
Oh my God. Where do you guys have access to a slush fund that I've never seen? This is amazing. We're going to buy, what did you say? We're going to buy a bunch of Daytonas and buy, Pete do things.
Slot cars.
Slot cars. That's it. Okay.
Slot cars.
Yeah. It's Not the Car is produced by the people you heard on this episode, which is to say every technical or narrative flaw in this show is on purpose, partly because we are all super geniuses and this is part of our giant plan. There are greater forces at work here than you can possibly imagine. The one and only Mike Perlman is our executive producer. I'm the show's creator. For more on bonus content, perks, and future live events, you can subscribe to our free newsfeed at patreon.com/notthecar. If you like this episode and you'd like to support what we do here, check out that same Patreon link and click Become a Member. If you're enjoying the show, please leave a review and share it with anyone you know who might enjoy it. Your recommendations make a huge difference, and they really do help us keep It's Not the Car on the air. If you're watching this on YouTube, I am not going to apologize for the fact that the mic is right in my face because, I don't know. I don't apologize for that. That's just my truth. As always, thank you for listening.
Have fun.
Have fun.